So we're super excited to welcome Allison Barner, who's visiting us from New England, from Maine at Colby College. I met Allison Barner as part of the James S. McDonald Fellowship, which is this prestigious, fellowship in complex systems that she had for a few years before joining the college. Colby College as a Clark Booth Assistant Professor of Biology. Allison works in super interesting intersection of ecology, climate change ecology, and networks. And so as you will see, a lot of affinity with the work that we're doing here at UVM, and I thought it would be really interesting to kind of push a little bit in the ecology direction with these talks. And so we're super happy to have you today. Welcome.
Thanks. Very happy to be here. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here, especially because I've been spending the last couple of years since I started at Colby in late 2019, I've been spending a lot of time really immersed in doing field work in sort of like some organisms focused field work. And my postdoc was all about thinking about networks, theory, simulation, computation, and I just would love to spend the next day or two talking more about that. It's been a while. So I'm going to talk about my work, my research program right now. And I'll give you a little bit of a background that draws on the computational work I've done, the ecological and field-based work that I've done, and sort of bring this together into a single framework. So one thing I found, I'm a marine community ecologist. So I work in the field, I do marine ecology. I'll talk a ton about organisms. And a lot of marine ecologists that I've met with and a lot of field-based ecologists are often really worried about sort of the loss of value around the type of work that they do. You know, is AI going to take over my field studies of my organisms? Does anyone care about the type of work that I do? Is there any value in it? Do I have to learn how to do simulations? Do I have to learn how to do this or that? And I think my goal is to really sort of bring together these two different ways of approaching just studying dynamics, studying why does the world look the way it does? Can we predict what it might do in the future, right? There's no one right or wrong way to go about this. And so we'll talk a bit about sort of the pros and the cons of field-based approaches, empirical-based approaches, and theory and simulation-based approaches to looking at specifically extinction in systems. So if you've played Jenga, we have here's a Jenga tower. And for example, we're going to say this Jenga tower represents an ecological community. Ecological community being a particular set of species at a particular place, at a particular point in time, and the set of species that are interacting with each other, right? And so if each one of our Jenga tiles is a species, we can think, well, what happens when we pull these Jenga tiles out, right? So if you played the game, you sort of know what's about to happen. So we could say, all right, so pollution might be a factor that's causing us to lose a species in a system, right? You're pulling a Jenga tower out, a Jenga tile, right? Lose another couple of species based off of habitat loss. Lose another based off of overfishing. It's looking a little bit perilous now, right? The whole tower sort of balancing on one species. And then you get the kicker of climate change and the whole thing's going to fall apart because this system is very unstable. This community is very unstable at this point in time, right? We can also think about, well, some Jenga tower constructions are more stable than others, right? So this one on the left, very sturdy. We have a community where the species at the top of the tower are sort of dependent on these sets of pretty well-built foundation species. Whereas over here, very precarious. I don't think this would actually stand up in reality. A tower that, maybe you pull out one of these bottom species, one of these foundation species, and you see the whole thing collapse. So this is the framework that I've been thinking about in terms of communities. So what are the factors that can predict whether or not we might see a community collapse based off of the loss of species and the loss of the effects that those species have on each other? So like I said, I'm going to talk about these sort of couple of different ways of thinking about stability, about thinking about interactions, how networks come into play here, and a project that we've been working on for the past couple of years to sort of bridge all of this together. So we'll start with sort of the more interaction network, more theory, computational stuff before I dig into talking about snails and barnacles and stuff. So this like is a classic question for network science. A classic question for community ecologists is this question of whether a large and complex network can be stable. So work in the 1970s, theoretical mathematical work suggested that a large complex network cannot be stable. And I have asterisks behind all of this because it's like, well, what do you mean about large? What do you mean by complex? And what do you mean by stable? Probably also, what do you mean by a network, right? So it's an overly simplistic set of statements that have, from the 1970s, really pushed a ton of work in the field, in multiple different fields, right? So a very rich statement to explore the meaning of. But I don't know if it's such a broad question. I don't know if we'll ever quite have the answer. But ecologists in particular were like, wait a minute, my system is complex and diverse. Are you telling me that this is my ecosystem and it's not stable? Because I go out there every year and it looks stable to me. So this is a very contentious statement for ecologists, especially field ecologists. So the idea behind sort of boiling down what we see in nature to a species interaction network, again, can be contentious because we are going to abstract away particular characteristics, particular traits, dynamics associated with individual species. And the goal is to sort of boil them down to a network, right? Where we have individual nodes of the network are species. So this is usually a single population of a single species. And again, we're talking about a community context. So this is at a particular place and time. We're not talking about giraffes, and whatever this fish is. I'm talking about species that are found together in a community, right? So you've got species as nodes, and you have their interaction are the edges, right? So what do we mean by interactions when we talk about ecology? Well, it's another thing I probably should have an asterisk next to it because there's a million different ways to define a species interaction. And I would love to talk about that. If people want to talk about how do you define, how do you measure, how do you quantify an interaction? Super interesting. Generally, we're talking about the per capita effect of one species on the growth rate of another species. So this could be not an effect, could be zero, could be positive, could be negative. Ecologists generally sort of classify these into sets of dynamics that are competitive. These could be, again, they could be asymmetric, right? They don't have to be both species have negative effects on each other. It could be one has a negative, one has a positive. We've got consumer resource interactions. So that's predation, herbivory, omnivory, parasitism. We have symbiosis. We have other types of positive effects. So that could be ecosystem engineering, stress amelioration, recruitment facilitation, lots of stuff gets lumped under positive interactions. And in ecology, again, these fields have really developed quite separate from each other. So in studying species interaction networks, we also get sort of whole different branches of the fields where some people are looking at food web, some people are looking at pollination networks, some people are looking at host parasite networks, and that doesn't always get brought under the same framework, even though mathematically they are quite similar. So this is sort of what we're working with, species interaction networks. This is what we mean when we say that. And so what we want to do is, okay, we want to quantify something about the stability of these networks, right? If our goal is to try to understand how do communities, how do systems respond to a disturbance, to some of these pressing anthropogenic changes, right? Then let's try to quantify stability. And another huge can of worms. We could spend hours, days, weeks talking about what do we mean by stability. Again, something that really means different things to different people, depending on what units you're talking about, what methods you're using. So I'm going to try to narrow in on the stability metric that I'm going to talk most about today. So you could measure stability And it could tell you something about how, looking at a time series of dynamics, right? So a time series of the number of individuals in a population, how does that change through time? Is it sort of returning back to an original state after a perturbation? Is it resistant to a perturbation? Analysis of these time series can give you a suite of stability metrics, right? We also have, and this is quite common to, and usually like where Bob May's stuff started out with, is thinking about the weighted interaction matrix. So this is a matrix that tells you the effect of species on each other. Weights mean something about interaction strength, though, again, what it's weighted by could be a million different things. But usually this is an interaction matrix that's telling you something about the strength of the interactions between species, not just do they interact, but how strong of an effect is there between species. But there's also metrics of stability that you can use that just use the binary interaction matrix. So does this species interact? Yes or no? And that's all you need to know. And there's a set of metrics that we can look at just using that. So when we think about what's the most informative, where did some of these big ideas about network stability start with? Well, that's really using the weighted interaction matrix. That's a very, very rich piece of information that is primarily not able to be studied empirically. This is because to measure the pairwise effects of everything in a system on each other is almost impossible in nature. But we have tons of empirical data on time series, obviously, and we actually have a lot of binary interaction matrix data. We're talking about thousands and thousands of published empirical interaction networks that just have, is this species interacting, yes or no? So we have a lot of empirical data on that. And there's a lot of, obviously, this has also been very well studied theoretically or with simulation, but weighted interaction matrix are sort of in the theory only area. Obviously, there are some exceptions to that, but generally when we're talking about systems with hundreds of species, which is typical, you can't really get there. Okay, so we're going to talk about just this, what we can do with this binary interaction matrix today. So I'm going to start sprinkling in some of my intertidal work. So here we have a mussel. This is one of the species that we'll be talking a lot about today. And it's interacting with, let's say we have a series of predators here or consumers. So here our mussel is the resource. We have sea stars, predatory snails, and lobster because it's Maine. So I have to include a lobster in all the talks. And lobster actually are in the intertidal system. So I'm not just making it up. Right, so here I don't have there's no weights on these links, it's just these things eat those things, right? So we'll talk about a couple of different things, and this is more of like a clarification of some of the language because these are concepts that cross disciplines, people have a million different words for them, right? So I'm going to mostly say secondary extinction, where we're talking about a situation where we have a loss of a species in response to the extinction of a resource species. So let's say if mussels are the resource, if mussels go extinct, could that cause a secondary extinction of their predators? Right. And this is measured, I mean, these are just some of the other things that you sort of see this called co-extinction, extinction cascade, cascading failure, network collapse. Those are sort of all wrapped up in this concept of measuring the robustness of the network. So robustness is a stability metric that you can, it's very extremely common where we can use this with a binary interaction matrix to measure just generally how resistant is a network against the possibility of these secondary extinctions happening. So I'm going to walk through an incredibly oversimplified example of how robustness is measured. This might be familiar to you, but just, for talking it through. So we're really trying to see how a species, the removal of one species or multiple species in sequence could cause cascading effects through the system. So here I've highlighted in a network that we'll talk about later, the mussel here, and all of the species that it's connected to in 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees. So all of the species it's connected to in the system. So a loss of the mussel, could it cause extinction in some of these really higher trophic level species? That's a question. And like I said, this is a concept that is very widely used across systems. So the idea of, can we detect, predict, or understand when an extinction of a particular node could have a cascading effect across a system? That is a general question. That's a general idea. So here, this great paper I go back to over and over, and was truly one of the reasons that I got into thinking about networks, was thinking about, okay, there's an extinction in the an extinction, maybe that's not what they called it, but say there's an extinction or an outage on the power grid. How does that affect the broader power grid across the country? How does that intersect with the internet grid? Is that a thing? I don't know. So this was a paper where they're trying to pull together 2 different types of networks. So a power grid network, internet network, pull those together and understand how failures in any one of those could affect the other, how this could cause a more catastrophic collapse than you might have expected. And I think that that's exactly the kind of question that we want to understand in ecosystems too. So how do we measure robustness from a binary interaction matrix? Again, there are no systems in nature. Maybe, I don't want to make such a bold claim, but I don't think there are that many systems in nature where you have just 4 species. So again, when I'm showing this overly simplified example, we're talking about a snapshot of something that's usually hundreds of species. You're running these simulations hundreds or thousands of times, and the sequence of species that go extinct is also randomized hundreds or thousands of times. So a really huge computational analysis boiled down to a couple slides here. So we'll start with 2 axes, right? We have the number of species that are removed. These are removed in the primary extinction. So this is some external factor causing this primary extinction. And then the y-axis is the number of species that are remaining. So this is measuring how many species go secondarily extinct. Let's say, so our first species that is removed, let's say we randomly remove that predatory snail. It's called a whelk. If you don't know anything about whelks, they're really cool. They have this like long tongue that has a little drill on the end of it, and the drill goes into the shells of other organisms. Then they stick themselves inside of there, externally digest their prey, and slurp it up through the hole. So really cool organisms because they can eat things that are much bigger than them. Anyways, so let's say this guy goes extinct in the network. How many species remain? Well, we still have 3 because these 2 species higher in the food web still have a resource to eat. They lost one of their resources, but the other one's still remaining. Okay, so maybe we're randomly saying species are being going extinct. So our next random from me species that goes extinct is that blue mussel. And so here, neither of these higher trophic level predators have a resource anymore, so they go extinct. So you can sort of see as I'm talking through this, what kind of assumptions are embedded in this analysis. Again, there are a lot of assumptions. We can get into that if you want to later. But how we then measure robustness is just the area under the curve here. So again, extremely well-studied and common metric of stability for interaction networks. And we might say, okay, well, we have a network that looks like this, where we see the loss of one species causes a huge cascade of other species to go extinct. That might be less robust. Whereas a system where, the number of species that are removed is really resilient, right? It's really resistant to the whole thing collapsing. That might be more robust. And so
That depends on the order of removal, right?
It could depend on the, great question. It could depend on the order of removal. It could depend on the structure of the network. And yes, both of those things. So when we're doing these kinds of analyses, so let me back up. These types of, this approach, again, laden with assumptions and one small metric among many to study stability, it does allow us to do analyses that otherwise we couldn't. So here is an example network. Again, a body of work that I just think is so fascinating and one of the coolest innovations we've seen in a long while in network ecology, which is, here's a system where interactions are observable without doing too many experiments, just sort of observing, let's say butterfly visiting the flower. So there's some resource interaction there. And what they did was not only looked at one type of interaction, but they looked at a ton of different types of interactions in a single system. So here we have all sorts of different feeding interactions. We have a parasite interaction. We have positive only interactions, so flower visitors, and all of this wrapped up into a single binary network. And we can study the stability of a network like this. We don't have measures of interaction strength, but we can still glean useful information. Yeah. I'm going to skip this next slide. I can come back to it if there's time, but just some other areas where using robustness analysis can give us some more information where we otherwise couldn't study stability. So, all right, so go through some like sort of pros and cons, though I don't know if they're necessarily cons. Don't want to be too negative, but some things to think about when we're thinking about network-based theory, simulation-based approaches to studying the stability of ecosystems. So we can connect between these more theoretical metrics of stability and empirical interaction networks using this robustness approach. Again, you can work with realistic complexity of interaction. So we're talking about a system that has thousands of species and, you know, factorially more interactions, right? So it's incredible, I think. But the cons are robustness analysis. Again, there are some studies that have been working on this, but they're generally static. So interactions aren't necessarily dependent on the presence or absence of other species. They're unweighted, so we don't have any sense of strength or the effect of abundance of species. We know that these interactions between things can change if one's common and one's rare. We don't really have a great sense on how this connects to other measurements of stability, but we also don't have a great sense on how other metrics of stability connect to that. So it's sort of this stability metrics body of work is very, very rich and dense. And we also get a number, right? This is robust. This robustness is this number, but we don't have any sense of what that means in a real field situation. Does this actually represent what we think? A system that's more stable because this robustness number is higher than a system that has a lower robustness number? We don't know yet. So let's think a little bit about how species interactions and stability is studied on the ground, right? How people are looking at the effect of species on each other or the possibility for a cascading extinction from a more traditional field community ecology approach. So this is where I work. This is the pretty pictures part of the talk. So my background is like in being trained as a field rocky intertidal community ecologist. And so that's still the bulk of the work that I do. Here is the Colby College Island campus. So it's a recent acquisition of the university. And this is one of our 8 field sites on the island, Allen Island in Maine. So if you have or have not spent any time in the rocky intertidal, I'll sort of give you a quick rundown of what we're talking about in this ecosystem and why I think it's so cool, though you probably hear a similar thing from anybody who does field work. But so the rocky intertidal ecosystem, it's a global ecosystem. Basically any rocky shore around the world, you'll find rocky marine shore, you'll find this ecosystem. And so let's just sort of like imagine, like put yourself in the summer because it's the gross part of winter right now. So think about summer, it's morning, it's dawn, right? You walk down to the ocean and the tide has gone out and the ocean has rolled back. And here on the rocks, you see this incredible ecosystem that is exposed to air a couple times a day, 2 times a day, usually, and for various amounts of time. So up to 6 hours at a time, you have these marine organisms that have to survive outside of the water. And what we see here is the rocky intertidal ecosystem. It's typically viewed as a zonal system. So it's sort of, if you're more familiar with maybe mountaintop ecosystems, you have like the very top of the mountain, and then the tree line, and then sort of different zones of trees and ecosystems you see along that, along the elevation of a mountain. And it's very similar in the intertidal, right? Because when the tide's in, it's over this low area longer, and it's very rarely reaching all the way up here. And you can sort of see the different zones in this picture. So we have this, what we call the low zone. In between here is the mid zone, high zone, and then this zone all the way up at the top is just bare rock that sort of gets a little splish splash every once in a while. So different zones are occupied by different types of species that are more or less tolerant to being outside of the water all the time. This down here is mostly red algae, which is like, if it grew any higher, it would just die. It's very sensitive to being out of the water. Whereas further up on the shore is stuff that, like, you know, you could just, I don't know, pick up a mussel and put it in your pocket and it would probably be fine for a while with that. Just like being out of the water. Very highly adapted to the system. So just an incredible system where you can study marine organisms by not diving, which I like. You can, like, it's
Keep dry.
well, nah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Simple question.
Yeah.
How great is the tide difference when it's back and when it's mid? It changes over the years, so probably goes through a couple of years.
Great question.
So these ecologies must be changing with them, or do they?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That's a great question. So the question was, how great is the difference between the highest high and the lowest low? And that does, I actually don't know the answer to how that changes over the course of the year, but over the course of the month, we do see a lot of variation in when the highest high is, what time of day, how high it is, how low it is. And that definitely does affect the organisms that can survive here. There are certain times of year where, so the tides also change when they're the lowest. So yes, we don't have to dive, but we do have to get up at 3 in the morning to study the system in the summer because the low tides are around 6 a.m. And so what we often see, for example, in the spring is there's always a week or so in May when the sun finally comes out. I don't know if that happens here. It happens in Maine where it's like, oh, the sun's out and now it's like 65. And these organisms in the winter, the low tides are generally at night. And so they're sort of really like, great, this is nice and cool. Nighttime, get a little icy, but that's fine. And then all of a sudden the low tides are in the day, it's 65 out and a whole bunch of them will die. So there's a lot of seasonal change that happens, but the general zonation patterns are pretty static.
Yeah.
But definitely a lot to think about there.
Yeah, and the tides are, you know, on a monthly cycle
Mhm.
due to the moon,
Mhm.
right? So that's probably not really enough time for like the ecosystem to like shift
Yeah.
up and down. So they must have to be stable across the
Mhm.
lunar cycle.
But you definitely, I mean, again, I could talk about this all day because it's a great point because it's like, for example, some of these organisms, like all this white here, these are barnacles, and barnacles will recruit, baby barnacles come recruit out of the ocean. They all land sort of in one day or a week, right? And so they might, if they land on the shore, they will just coat everything. And you will see them coating, living on the algae. They'll land way up high in the intertidal and you're like, oh God, sorry, buddy, like you are not going to survive. Like this is terrible. We see them growing on top of algae, which again, it's like the algae will just like sort of like slough off the, yep. And so anyways, lots of cool monthly dynamics. Again, I'll talk about this all day, but I do want to keep going. So just a quick like summary of some of the cast of characters that I'll talk about. So this is the algae that we see in the rocky intertidal. So I'm really going to focus a lot on these canopy forming algae. So they're sort of longer. They're sort of the trees of the intertidal. Things that live under them are little shrubs, right? The great thing about this system is that it's small scale. If we want to ask a question like, how does the tree forest canopy affect the things that live under it? Experimentally, I guess we could go down and chop down trees. Like, that's not great, but I guess it happens. But here we can just say, all right, let's take snip, cut off these species, the scale of which, the longest canopy forming guys probably get like this long. So they're not very big. The scale of experimental manipulation here is very tractable.
Do you do like a gridded system and come back and? All right.
We will get there. Yep, we will. We do. So other organisms, there's real high diversity of algae. There's also a suite of sessile, so non-moving animals that filter feed. So they feed whatever's in the water. So barnacles, mussels, sponges, and tunicates are some of those. We have herbivores, so sea urchins, something you might be familiar with, and a whole suite of different snail species. And we have a whole bunch of different consumers. So we have our predatory snails, we have a couple of different crab species, sea stars, and a suite of birds that feed in the system, as well as fish, but I'm more of like a snail person than like a vertebrate person. So I don't know much about the fish. So these are our species. And like I said, they're really small. So our snails, this is a finger, right? These snails are teensy tiny. This is probably the biggest crab we ever saw in one of our experiments. And then this is 10 centimeters, I think, long, or maybe 15. And this is the scale of how big things are, right? So we're talking about very small system, easy to manipulate. Okay. You can sort of see, this is us going back to an experiment, which I will talk about in a sec. And the scale of the interactions that happen are small, right? So we're talking about our experimental plots are 25 by 25 centimeters. So how do community ecologists ask questions about species interactions? How do they quantify? If someone was like, I want to quantify all the interactions in the rocky intertidal, they're going to do species removal experiments. These are some of the oldest experiments you can do in marine ecology. Take one species out, measure the effect that it has on other species, right? So you can have plus prey, remove the predator, compare that to a suite of other treatments, and get some measurement of the effect of one species on another. Big caveat is that, again, just in case you were wondering, this is very still unresolved exactly how these field measurements of interaction strengths map to theoretical measurements of interaction strength. Some great reviews from almost 20 years ago now, still unresolved. But a really old system to study in. So this is from 1916, one of the first ever food webs constructed or visualized is from the rocky intertidal in Maine. So some pros and cons of studying systems this way. The time scale is fast. I mean, we can do experiments and see changes in a year, a summer, or 2 years, right? So this is pretty fast compared to maybe a decadal scale that you might see in other systems. The spatial scales are very tractable for field experiments. We can say, I'm going to remove every predator from this area and see what effect it has. That would be quite difficult in a system where you have to exclude wolves, like Yellowstone, wolf removal addition experiments. We can just sort of pick up sea stars and put them somewhere else. And this system has a very long history of work in it. So it's a system where we can build on past work quite easily. And we can mine not just the ecological literature, but the natural history observation literature to get a lot of sort of information about the systems that we work on. The cons of studying species interactions with experiments is it's incredibly labor intensive, and like maybe the right word is expensive, though I am talking about money, but also not talking about money. It's just so difficult to get estimates of species interactions from a field experiment. It requires a lot of labor, a lot of time, a lot of people. Interactions can, in the system that I work in, can be difficult to observe without experiments. That's not to say that in other systems, there are lots of exceptions here. Like if you see, like, you know, you're out in Serengeti, lion eats antelope, like, yeah, I observed that interaction. It's a little bit more nuanced in other systems. And if you are looking at a system where you have hundreds of species, how on earth are you going to be able to do enough experiments to look at those pairwise effects? And that's why we don't generally have weighted interaction estimates in nature. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing to try to bridge these two approaches together. Not that one is right or wrong, but that by looking at the work that's been done on species interaction networks and looking at the work that's been done using field or just empirical experiments, we can identify fruitful areas for future work, areas where just a little bit more development of theory could push us really far. Just a little bit more development of our field-based work could really open up some new doors. So going back to this idea about robustness analysis. So when we're running a simulation, we have an empirical network and we're simulating species extinction, measuring robustness. What information is that actually telling us? This is still a big question, right? It gives us some estimate of the stability of a given network to the removal of a single species. What that number means is like, not totally sure. Maybe you have to compare it to another system that has a different robustness, right? So it's sort of a relative metric that might not have absolute meaning. It could tell something about the potential for tipping points or cascades. Like, is there a particular species, a node in the network that its removal will cause the collapse? So it might help us identify particularly important nodes in a network. And it actually can, though, again, this really hasn't been explored much, it can predict the identity of species that go secondarily extinct. So if you can identify that one node that's really important, you also, these simulations read out, or you can read out exactly which nodes are affected by that extinction. So our work is focused on leveraging these predictions made by robustness analysis and actually testing them in field context. So the question being, does the robustness analysis of an empirical network give us, does it actually map to stability? Does it actually tell us something about the identity of these species that go secondarily extinct? If it doesn't, let's figure out why. So when we're simulating extinction, we can do this on an empirical interaction network, like I mentioned. So this is that, you know, someone's quantified this using experiments, using natural history observation, using a combination of all the above. They've got some measure of the binary interactions in the system. Or you could have generated a network theoretically using whatever tool you want. There's a whole bunch of different ways to do this, to generate random, realistic, not realistic interaction networks. And then you simulate extinction on those. So there's sort of two approaches here. One example of how you might do this is, okay, so here is a Lepidoptera, so that's moths and butterflies, and their host plant species. And you could say, all right, let's simulate the loss of their host plant, that's their resource, check to see how many species go extinct, estimate robustness, right? That's sort of the typical pipeline of analysis. What you could also do is compare the number of predicted species that go extinct to the observed extinction of these species, which actually is possible. A fantastic paper by Pierce and Altermat, again, from about a decade ago, really think is explored, a super cool paper where they compared this predicted number of extinctions they've got the actually observed extinctions in the region overall and due to the loss of the host plants. And then they compared, so what I'm going to show you is a whole bunch of different simulations. So we can see here, depending, like was mentioned earlier, depending on the sequence of plant extinction, we see some different results. But at least for some of these extinction sequences, the predicted number of extinctions maps pretty well to the observed number of extinctions. And this is one of the few studies that have actually tried to pair this empirical and theoretical piece together.
Do the actual species match to, or is it just number?
I can't remember. I am not sure. I'm sure they say it though. It might not be actual species. It's a great question. I'm not sure. So, right, we have theoretical versus empirical interaction network. And then the next step is comparing these simulated extinctions to some sort of like observed extinction, right? Or some empirical extinction, right? So a simulated extinction on an empirical interaction network that's doing something like, running this robustness analysis. An empirical extinction on an empirical interaction network, this might be doing exactly what they did in that past study, right? So observing, comparing to an observed number of extinctions, or maybe looking at these species interaction experiments where you compare what happens when you remove one thing to what happens if the system's undisturbed. So we have a paper came out late last year, digging all into this. I would urge you to read it if you're interested. There's a ton of work. So we did a review as well, where we've got a ton of work that's been done sort of in the top half of this quadrant. To our knowledge, there's only a handful of papers that have compared the predicted number of extinctions with some sort of observed number of extinctions or observed extinction dynamics. And that's these 3 papers here. So 2 observational, 1 experimental. Huge area that has not been explored is this sort of side here, where maybe you would use theory to generate different types of interaction networks that might be more or less stable, then assemble them experimentally, maybe in a lab experiment, and make an observation about how that extinction occurs, right? And so this is using what we know from a theoretical network to then assemble it and observe the matching extinction dynamics empirically. I don't think anybody's done that yet. So, like I said, got a paper that came out last year talking all about this. And running out of time, when do we go to?
Oh, you have 5-10 minutes.
5-10 minutes. Okay. I'll blast through this last little piece together because this is all about how we are putting this framework to use. So we have a grant from NSF. My collaborator, Laura D at University of Colorado Boulder is our co-PI. And a lot of the work that has been done is by my postdoc Dana at Colby College, also the author of the paper I just, the lead author of that paper I just talked about, and our newly minted former graduate student now, as of last week, Dr. Aislinn Keys, who's done a bunch of the work on this project as well. The rest of everybody up there is a mix of Colby and Colorado students. So back to the field. So our work takes place, right, in this extremely high warming region of the ocean. And it's a place where we've actually been observing the long-term decline of a really, really important species. So this zone here should be dominated by mussels. I don't know. I don't eat mussels, but I know a lot of people do. So, I hear they're delicious, very important. They are very economically important. They're also really ecologically important species. They're the main prey species for a lot of organisms. They're habitat builders. So a lot of things live inside and on them, and they're dominant competitors. And they should be this whole region here. But they're not. They've collapsed in the last 40, 50 years. We've seen a decline from about 75 to 100% cover of mussels down to something like under 10% cover. So I'll show you what that looks like. I'm sort of skipping ahead. So this is what it would look like if you have 100% of the substrate covered by mussels, right? You sort of see a whole field of mussels. And this is a contemporary picture of the system.
Yeah.
So we have lost this, not completely, not totally extinct, but very, very low abundance. So this is the framework, this is how we're thinking about this system, right? We might not ever know why the mussel has gone extinct. We have some ideas, but we can also ask what's happening to the rest of the system when that species does go extinct. So our work is, again, with the same framework. We're working in mostly in these two quadrants, where we're building an empirical interaction network for the region, comparing that to our experimental extinctions. So we've built a food web. The whole side part that I haven't talked about, which is we're also thinking about other properties of the network that could be affected by extinction. So these are ecosystem services and functions. So something about what these organisms do, not just do these nodes go extinct, but what their job is in the ecosystem. How is that affected? From the food web, we're doing robustness analyses, looking at the effect of extinctions on these different species, functions, and services. Hopefully going to be able to explore some of these questions about structure and stability. And we're testing these predictions made by robustness analysis against a historical time series that we've got now synthesized from across the region, and an experimental extinction that we're running in the field. So I might wrap up so there's time for questions, but I can also go back to these if people have questions about it. I'm going to sort of skip ahead. This looks interesting. Ask me about it later. Okay. Well, I don't have any results to show from this project. So we got the grant in 2021. And so it's still ongoing. I'm just doing field work last month, out doing field work in a week. So we're still collecting data. We have this is our food web for the region that we've synthesized. So this includes all trophic interactions, including parasite, post-parasite interactions for the region. So this is synthesized from existing databases, literature, and yeah, so we're very data rich at this point. If anyone wants to talk about like ideas for collaboration, very interested. But where I want to wrap up with this is, so our work is trying to ground truth some of the predictions made by network analysis, and just not just in ecological sense, but more broadly across different types of networks, right? So can we test these predictions in the field? That doesn't mean it's the be all end all of what those predictions are, but let's just take one step. Interested in operationalizing some of these ideas in network science for conservation and restoration. So again, with a focus in our system on this ecologically, economically important species, if we wanted to, for example, try to restore this species, could that be amplified, prohibited by the interactions in the system? That's something that I think is worth exploring. And really, to me, still trying to get at the question of community ecology, right? To what extent does community and network structure predict the ecosystem dynamics and the functioning of that ecosystem? That's the biggest question that we've got in community ecology. It's probably the same question that many of you are interested in asking about, does structure predict dynamics, right? This is one piece of that. Want to make a quick plug for collaborations. If people want to talk, again, I'm here tomorrow as well. Love to talk about potential collaborations. I'm still new to the region, lived on the West Coast and worked on the West Coast for many years. Other projects I'm really interested in thinking about are hybrid networks, so networks of different interaction types or different links between the nodes. Really interested in thinking about network dynamics as they are associated with some sort of perturbation and recovery. And this may be really basic, but we've got so much data that's embedded in photographs. So really interested in thinking about ways to use machine learning and classification to help extract some of the data that we've got that's sort of locked in a photographic box, right? So thank you for listening. Thanks everybody on Zoom. Happy to take questions. Email me if you're not here, but you're on Zoom and you want to ask some questions. I'm happy to take any questions we have time for.